godsloverevealed.com. Thank you, and may God bless you with a greater revelation of His love for you. We're going to be looking at a full life-size replica of the Shroud of Turin. We're going to talk about what is the Shroud of Turin. We're also going to talk about the Shroud of Turin Research Project, what science says about the age of the shroud, and Scripture in the shroud, how the Scripture lines up with what you see on the shroud, and what science believes caused the image that you see on the shroud. So what is the Shroud of Turin? The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus, and I believe that with every fiber of my being, that this is the burial cloth of Jesus. It measures 14'3" by 3'7", which happens to equal the Jewish measurements of 8 cubits by 2 cubits. It's stained with human blood, which matches the biblical account of the crucifixion, and it is, in fact, the single most studied artifact in human history. Now, before we go any further, I want to orient you with what you're seeing, because the image that you see of a man is very faint. It is a man that has been scourged and crucified. The dark areas that you see are blood, but you can see the hair, you can see the face, and you also see the back of the body going this way. And we'll talk about why you see that mirror image a little later on in the presentation. On the edges, you see something that looks like scorch marks down both sides. That's because in 1532, this was being stored in a church in Chambry, France, in which a fire broke out. And the fire almost took the shroud from history, but it was folded up and in a metal case, but that metal case got so hot that it's said to have melted in some areas, and you can see what looks like and is believed by some to be places where the metal case dripped through. Now, because it was folded, you can also see a mirror image of that on the other end down here. Now, in 1534, there were repairs done to the shroud. Those repairs are what you see right here. The Poor Clare nuns, which were in the church in Chambry, France, and they were skilled in textile repair. They put the patches on, and if you look at the patches, you can see that these two line up. They're a mirror of each other because the shroud was folded. So the places that were burned badly, patches were put on. Now, if you also look, it's a little bit hard to see because of the light, but you can see that that cloth is different, that cloth is different, that cloth is different along the edges. In 1534, they put a backing on the shroud because it was 1,500 years old. It had been handled a lot, and the obvious area for it to begin to weaken and tear were on the edges, so that's why you see that backing there. But it was done to reinforce the entire shroud. So we see blood stains here, we see scourge marks on the back. We'll talk further about that as we continue into the presentation. So, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Why did people become so interested in studying the shroud? So you see a photograph there. That is a negative image. So when you take a photograph of the shroud, what you actually see here, we would consider to be the negative, because the negative is usually what is very faint and just kind of shows an outline of what the picture is going to become. But when you take a photograph of this, the negative becomes a picture. So in 1898, Secondo Pia, he took the first photograph of the Shroud of Turin, and he said that he almost dropped the glass plate when he got the negative, because he saw the face of Jesus looking back at him. So science did become interested in that in 1898 when he showed the world what happened when he took a photograph. But they looked at it, they questioned him, and they could not explain it. They didn't have access to the shroud. So they said that that was a fraud, that he had somehow manipulated the photograph, and they wrote him off as someone who had committed a fraud to try and trick people. So in 1931, Giuseppe Henry took the second photograph of the shroud, and he took around 100 photographs of the shroud, and he got the same results. And Secondo Pia, he was pleased to see those results. He was still alive, and he saw them, and he breathed a sigh of relief when he saw them, that he came up with the same thing. So that photograph garnered more interest in the shroud. But it was very hard to get access to the shroud. The Catholic Church had custodial care of the Shroud of Turin, and they didn't show it very often. So in 1976, this particular photograph was ran through what is called a VP8 image analyzer by some naval scientists. A VP8 image analyzer was actually designed to take X-rays and separate the lights and darks and create 3D-like images. Well, they ran this photo through, I presume because they thought it looked like an X-ray. And they ran it through the VP8 image analyzer, and to their surprise, it gave true 3D-like results. You can see the hair, you can see the beard and chin, you can see the mustache, the nose, the eyebrows, everything, and the entire body gave a 3D-like dimension on the VP8 image analyzer. And they were amazed by this. They were amazed because there's not another picture, there's not another drawing, there's not another painting in the world that gives true 3D-like results when ran through the VP8 image analyzer. It is actually a one of a kind. So, in 1976, Drs. Tom Jumper and John Jackson became very interested in studying the shroud because they were present when this was ran through the VP8 image analyzer. And they got a team of 40 scientists together within about 2 months of doing this, and they formed the Shroud of Turin Research Project, the STURP team. And so let's go ahead and roll out the photograph, which is the negative image. And this negative image, the photograph, was taken by Barry Schwartz, who was a photographer on the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And you're going to see the entire front view and the results of his photograph that he took in 1978. Now, Barry Schwartz, he was a Jew, and he was asked to be on this project, this team, and he didn't want to be at first. He said, first of all, I'm a Jew. What is a Jew doing studying something that's supposed to be the burial cloth of Jesus? And his second reason for not wanting to go, he says, look, we're going to spend all this time and money getting ready to go out to Turin, Italy, and then we're going to go out there and truck all this equipment out there to study the Shroud of Turin, and we're going to find that it's a fraud. We're going to find paint, dyes, powder, something like that, and it's going to explain how the image got there. So he decided to go anyway. And he decided there were 3 reasons why God wanted him to be on this Shroud of Turin research project. And the first reason, he said, was because he was a Jew that had turned his back on his faith. And he said this returned him to his faith in God. And he said the second reason is because he was to proclaim the truth. And the truth that he's talking about proclaiming is that this indeed is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And the third reason that he gave is because he said God always uses a Jew as the messenger. So we see that Barry has a sense of humor. So now on to the Shroud of Turin research project itself. Their primary goal was to determine what the properties were that caused this faint image of a man, and also what might have caused it. So that was their goal. So they spent 2 years from 1976 to 1978 coming up with the different tests that they would run. They were given 5 days of access to it in 1978. So they didn't waste 1 minute. They actually had all of their tests lined out how long they would take. And while some scientists were sleeping, other scientists were running tests. So they spent a full 5 days studying this with the primary purposes of determining how the image got there and what might have caused it. So after doing that, they spent an additional 3 years analyzing the data, the results of their study. And in part, their statement basically said, we don't know how that image got there. We don't know what the properties are. But what we do know is that it is the image of a man who has been scourged and crucified. It does have real human blood on it. It's stained with real human blood. And we know that there are no dyes, pigments, or anything like that that could have possibly caused the image to be on there. So part of that team was a forensic pathologist by the name of Robert J. Buckland. And he did a forensic pathology report. So basically, he did the same type of thing that he might do if this were evidence in a murder trial. He found out exactly what he could about the body. He found out everything he could about the injuries sustained to the body. And so we're going to go over part of what he found out. One, we find that Jesus was 175 pounds approximately and 5'11". So he wasn't a slight man. And as we go to the injuries, he found a ring of puncture tracks on the scalp in the shape of a wig or a crown. Not a ring like this, but in the shape of a wig that covered his entire head, which blood issued and went downward. There's also a distinct abrasion on the nose and the eye. The right cheek is swollen. And you see those blood issues from the puncture wounds on the scalp up here and all the way down to the nape of the neck back here. There's a large blood stain over the right pectoral region. And the blood flow also had water in that blood flow. And unlike the other blood flows that you see, like up here, blood shows up white in this negative image. This one is distinctly a post-mortem blood flow. So the person was dead when this blood flow occurred, and there is a puncture wound in the side in which that blood flow emitted out of, caused by a sharp penetrating object, like a spear. The left hand bears distinct puncture injury, and the projection of the blood flows could not have happened with the hands in this position, but would have had to have happened with the hands upward at about a 65-degree angle. So that blood flow that occurred down the back of the arm. Only 4 fingers are visible, so look at the fingers. You don't see thumb on either hand. And that suggests that the medial nerve was damaged, the medial nerve in here, which would have caused flexion of that thumb. So when the nails were put through the hands, they were put through at an angle to get back into the wrist. And studies have shown that if you put the nail through right here on the average weight of a male, that it's not going to hold that hand, and it's going to rip right through the hand. So the Romans must have known that, and they made it a practice to drive the nail in at an angle so that it went through the wrist. The right calf is more distinct than the left calf, indicating the left foot was probably on the top of the right foot, and that a spike was driven through both feet, a single spike driven through both feet. So it would have been similar to this with a spike driven through, and that position was maintained after rigor. So when Jesus was put into the burial cloth, rigor had already set in. His body was already stiff. You do see the blood flow from both feet right here, and you see it there with just a little bit on this side, and that's likely because one foot is raised higher than the other, and that's the top of the cloth, and this is the bottom. Series of traumatic injuries on the back caused by a whipping-like motion from the back and leaving dumbbell-shaped marks in the back with issuing blood. There is evidence on the shoulder blades of a heavy abrasion on one side, hard to see here, but we will see something later on that shows us that. Consistent with a heavy object such as a beam resting on the shoulders that would have been caused when carrying the cross. Now, I want to go over, there's so much that we could talk about and so many scientific facts. You really get sucked in if you start studying the shroud, because there's so much information out there, because all of this information, the hundreds of thousands of hours of studies, have been published, and you can find so much information. But I've put a few scientific facts up here that just speaks of the authenticity of where this came from, because a lot of you may know that a lot of people believe this is a medieval forgery out of Europe, somewhere out of Europe. This medieval forger was very smart if he did that. So just keep that in mind as we talk about some of these scientific facts. There's limestone dust particles found in the shroud that are from Israel, from that area. And we know from tradition that limestone caves, soft limestone, was dug out to build burial tombs, cave tombs for the people. And the Jewish custom was to leave the body in there for a year, but Jesus only needed it for 3 days, so that the body would decompose while in that cave, and then the bones would either be moved to an ossuary or they would be moved over to the side and make room on that slab for another body. There are traces of aloe and myrrh found within the cloth, and we know the Jewish burial custom was to pack the body in burial spices. It even says so in the Gospels, as is the custom when they talk about putting the spices on there. There are soil traces found under the foot, on the knee, and on the nose. Now, the ancient Jewish burial custom was to clean the body before they buried it. However, there was one exception. If the blood continued to flow after a violent death, they would just wrap the body in linen and bury it as is without cleaning it. So we find not only the blood flows and all of that, which is a question a lot of people have, well, wouldn't they have cleaned the body? No, not in this case. But we also find dirt that was on various places. Evidence of a wooden cross. There are oak tubules, which are microscopic splinters that were found that in the blood that issued from the back of the head. The blood on the shroud preceded the image. So science showed that everywhere that you see blood, that was deposited there before you see the image of the man that appeared afterwards. And it's believed that image occurred at the point of resurrection. Widow's mites, minted in 29 AD, were on the eyes of Jesus. So we see here, this is holographic photography. It's really meant to be viewed with 3D glasses on. But one of the interesting things is that in 2005, it was determined that this two-dimensional photograph has holographic properties encoded into it. It's the only known two-dimensional photograph in the world to have holographic properties built into it. So you see the little spots right here on the eyes. Those are the widow's mites. You can actually see in this photograph too the white spots right there and there. That's where the widow's mites are. And they were only able to be seen using different techniques to pull them out. And using the holographic photography, they also pulled out something else. And we're going to watch a couple of short videos that talks about the widow's mites and also what is known as an amulet underneath the beard. So if you look right here, there is the outline of something underneath the neck. And we're going to see when using the holographic photography, they're able to pull that out. It actually has Hebrew letters on there. So we're going to take a look from a documentary.
But once it was discovered that there were other images on the shroud, Dr. Wanger began looking closer and found that there were small coins on each eye. What significance could that possibly have? Dr. Alan Wanger, in his book, The Shroud of Turin, Adventure and Discovery, points out that not only are they there, they present distinct and profound clues as to the date and origin of the image.
Father Francis Philus was professor of the theology as well as a scientist who investigated the Shroud of Turin, as well as a photographer. He was working with a group of researchers who were attempting to identify what the projections over the eyes were, thinking they might be coins. And Dr. Philus had enlargement made of the excellent photographs he had of the shroud and noticed a patterning over the right eye. On enlargement of this, he noticed that there were letters which he interpreted as UCAI and something that looked like a shepherd's crook. This is typical of the lepton, or the widow's mite, struck by Pontius Pilate in the years in 29 AD to 33. We can identify the images of them, and so we can identify the particular coin. and know the origin as well as the date, which both of them are that we identify are struck in 29 AD. So this dates the shroud back to the 1st century. It also localizes it to Israel, since these coins are just the widow's mites or the common penny of the time, and certainly would not circulate either outside of Israel or not very long after the reign of Tiberius Caesar, to which they were dedicated.
So now we'll take a look at what holographic photography revealed underneath the beard.
The most exciting things that we found in the hologram was under the beard in the neck. It was known already that there was a white line, but nobody could ever say what that exactly meant and what it was. It's a solid object. It is in the form like something like an amulet that was put there. Now, after studying it for quite a while, I could figure out that there were letters on it, on top, sticking out a little bit.
Well, it turns out that information on that plaque is evident in some photographs and not in others. And the people at the Eindhoven Holographic Lab in Holland found that slight variations in the focusing distance brought that information out. So on one photograph where we have this information, it was just by pure luck that everything was right and they captured it. And what's that is suggestive of is that there is different information at different depths into this image. And Dr. Peter Soons thought he saw letters there, and he talked with a rabbi and scholar who was fluent in the Aramaic and Hebrew, and the letters are apparent, and they translated those into a meaningful phrase, which says a lot about who this might be.
Amazing. So next we're going to look at just a hologram that shows the three-dimensional aspects that are encoded in this. It's just absolutely amazing. And you can see the hair really good, the beard really good, the mustache. So it's just absolutely amazing, the information that is encoded into this photograph. It's a one-of-a-kind. So let's talk about scientific dating. So how many of y'all remember in 1988 that it was determined that this is about 700 years old? Yeah. So they sang it from the rooftops that this is a medieval fraud. It's a fake. You know, it was in all the papers. Everybody heard about it. Well, nobody really heard about why those tests came out that way. So we're going to take a quick look at what happened. One, we're looking at a highlighted area of the corner in which they took the sample from, and that is right down here. So it is adjacent to one of those areas in which the Holland backing shows through, because the original material is just gone, and they sewed the backing on. So that picture right there shows there are 4 different segments that were sent off to 4 different laboratories, or 3 different laboratories. Arizona got 2, Zurich and Oxford got 1. So right here on the right is spectral photography that Barry Schwartz took. Well, spectral photography fluoresces different colors based on the chemical composition of the fabric that's being photographed. So that spectral photography showed up orange, yellowish red right in there. That's the main body of the shroud. Well, if we look back at the Holland backing, which we know was put on in 1534, we see it's a deep blue-green color. Well, if we look at the area right here, it looks like it's kind of fades from that deep blue-green into the orangish yellow color. So many people tried to say why that carbon dating testing came off. They said, oh, well, you had that fire in 1532, the C14 content was changed because of that. They said over the centuries, people cried on it, they kissed it, there was a lot of bacteria on it, and it changed the results because of that. But no one had anything that science could look at and say, hey, possibly so. Let's look a little deeper into that. So there was a couple from Ohio, Sue Benford and Joe Marino. They're not scientists. Sue Benford ran a nonprofit organization. Joe Marino, he was a former Benedictine monk that had become a librarian at Ohio State University. And he had studied the shroud since 1977, but his wife didn't have a whole lot of interest in it. But then one day she saw him watching a documentary, and she saw the face of Christ. And she knew, everything within her said, that is the face of Jesus. And then she got interested in determining why those carbon dating results came up the way they did. So she went to work, and she found stuff on the internet using Barry Schwartz's website, where he had photographs that he had taken in 1978 on the Shroud of Turin research project, high-definition photographs of every area of the shroud, little pieces at a time, and they were all labeled where they came from. So she looked at this section right here, and there's a distinct herringbone weave throughout the shroud that was consistent with what may have been done in the 1st century. And so she looked, and she was looking at that particular section, and the herringbone weave was so consistent anywhere you looked on the shroud. But when she looked there, she said it looked off axis. So she and her husband end up writing a paper that ends up getting publicated, telling why the shroud dating came up wrong. And they're not scientists, but they said, you can see the herringbone weave is very consistent, but then you can see it seems to change axis right here, and it has a line that you can kind of see, and it goes like that. And what they said in the paper is that new cloth was introduced, likely in 1534 by the Poor Clare nuns doing repair, and it was introduced, and here's the axis of it. And if you look, that means that the new cloth mixed in with the old cloth ends up getting deeper and deeper into the sample that was used for carbon dating testing. Well, they sent off, before they wrote the paper, they sent off pictures of this to 2 textile experts and said, can you tell me about this weave? And they said, oh, well, that looks like a French reweave. Well, a French reweave is something where you take 2 different fabrics and you try and make them look like they've never been repaired. So if you take 2 fabrics and put them together, usually you're going to have the old fabric, existing fabric, new fabric, and then you'll put stitching around it and just join them together. Well, in a French reweave, you don't do that. You take the ends and unravel them from both of the fabrics, and then you wrap them together so that you end up with something like that. And that's what they said was done here. So, look at the dates. So this one on the end here has the oldest date, and look, it has what they propose to be the most amount of original fabric and least amount of the new fabric. And as you go, those dates continue to increase from 1238 to 1246 to 1326 to 1430. And so it looks plausible. But they're not scientists. They never have had the shroud in their presence. They're looking at pictures online. Scientists say this is bad science. They don't pay any attention to it. But in particular, Ray Rogers, the lead chemist on the Shroud of Turin research project, it drives him batty. He sees this, and he's not a man of God. He doesn't believe in God. He believes in science, and he believes in good science. He hates bad science. But he ends up calling his friend Barry Schwartz and says, can you believe this? They're not even scientists. You know, this is crazy. I can disprove this in 5 minutes. So he says, well, Ray, go for it. So I'm going to let you hear from Ray what he did next.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw. So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005.
So Ray Rogers, he was battling cancer at the time he was doing this research. It was his last project. He died before that was published. But one of the things I don't want you to miss, he worked in the Los Alamos lab in Arizona for years. He retired from there. And he actually took a part of the carbon dating sample. So when you carbon date something, you completely burn what you use for the carbon dating testing. However, it's typical if there is enough material to hold back a section of that and hold it just in case you need to look back on it. So he contacted the lab and got access to, and before he would publish his paper in Thermochemica, he wanted to make sure that what he was seeing was right with the samples that he had, which he had tape samples where he had taken tape and labeled where he had placed them on the shroud, pulled them up, and it pulled fibers up. And that's what he did, which took him about 2 hours to review and give a call back to his friend Barry Schwartz and say, I believe they're right. So one of the things that he said is additional dating of the shroud via carbon-14 is probably not possible. And that's because the Catholic Church, in their custodial care of the shroud, they have a box which they keep it in, and they started treating it with thymol, which kills anything alive. And so he said that it probably has skewed any chance for a appropriate carbon dating testing. But scientists have done additional testing, and one of them was Ray Rogers. As a part of this thermochemical paper, he measured vanillin loss, which is a chemical test. Vanillin is something that is in linen, and it does disappear, and there is a known rate. It doesn't give you a real tight range, but he determined that it was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, the cloth was. There are two spectroscopy tests that were done, one infrared and one Raman spectroscopy, and they came up with dates between 1,600 and 2,300 years old and 1,500 and 2,200 years old. So all these date ranges fall right within what they need to be for it to be a first century cloth. And the earliest date ranges say it's at least 700 more years old than what the carbon-14 dating says. So did the shroud influence early art? I'm going to show a couple of examples of that. And, you know, from the forehead to many other features, there are things that we can pull out, but I'm going to point out just some obvious things. One, the hair on this side shows up and not so much on this side. So you look, there are multiple examples of Jesus being painted like this. You look, what we know now is the amulet underneath the beard makes it look like he has a boxy neck. Look how boxy the neck is here. The nose has a distinct bend a little bit to that side, and we see that bend right here. The face is misshapen, and the cheekbone is swollen over here. Look at the misshapen face and the cheekbone here. So that is a 6th century Byzantine painting at St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the base of Mount Sinai. Here's a 12th century painting, and you see the hair again over here and over here are different, more prominent over here. You see the bend in the nose, you see the misshapen cheeks, and you see something else that is in a lot of them. It's a part in the beard. Why do we see a part in the beard? Well, we see a part in the beard there. So we see that in a lot of early paintings. Now we go to something that is modern, and it wasn't based on the shroud. But what this was based on, and we're looking at this painting right here called Prince of Peace, done by a little girl named Akiana. She did it when she was 8 years old. Well, Akiana, what did she use for her inspiration? When she was 4, she grew up in a home with an atheist mother and an agnostic dad. Religion wasn't talked about in their home. But when she was 4, she started having experiences where she would go to heaven. She would either do it in dreams or in visions. And she actually would see Jesus and talk to him. So she had this picture of him in her mind and ingrained in her mind. Well, at age 4, she started drawing. At age 6, she started painting. And at age 8, she painted this and called it Prince of Peace. She was self-taught, she says, taught by God how to paint. Well, we look at this, and then we look at the shroud. This right here is where an artist has just taken the shroud and put flesh tone on it and given him eyes instead of this. And then we look here at this painting. So we've had experts on the shroud compare the two, and experts have given 80 to 90% accuracy as far as what we see in the features. So if you look at the forehead, you see they are distinctly similar. The nose is pretty much exactly the same. The shape of the cheeks are pretty much the same. You get down here to the mouth, very, very similar. So it's amazing that this girl that had this experience, and I don't know how many of y'all saw Heaven is for Real, but this painting is what the little boy in Heaven is for Real looked at and said, yeah, that's Jesus, that's him. So this is one of my favorite parts, taking the scriptures and lining them up with what we see in the shroud. And the first thing we have to do is say, okay, was there a linen cloth that Jesus was laid in? In the book of Mark, we find that Joseph brought a linen cloth, took him down and wrapped him in the linen cloth and laid him in a tomb. So we have that mirror image here because he was laid down on this cloth as it was laid out, and then that cloth was folded over him, and then other linen wrappings were wrapped around him. In John it says, so they took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen wrappings with spices, as the burial custom of the Jews. So we know that aloe and myrrhs were found in the shroud. So we do know from John that also this cloth was there after the resurrection. Stooping in and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb and saw the linen wrappings lying there and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying within the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So I've highlighted face cloth because that is believed to exist today as well. And it's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And this is a picture of the Sudarium of Oviedo. And what you have here is blood, and we're going to find out that the markings of the blood are consistent with the markings on the shroud. And also, this was wrapped around the head, all the way around the head. And it is believed it was wrapped around the head while he was in an upright position on the cross. And this, scientists have found to be pleural edema, which is what builds up in the lungs when you die of asphyxiation, and that's what you die of when you're crucified. And it's presumed that